logical end point of this series of interactions with the crowds, but particularly with the Jewish leaders who rejected Jesus. And so because we find the principle in the Torah of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, what you would, some theologians call retributive justice. As the leadership and the nation rejects God, then he rejects them. And so in chapter 13, as it opens, we find Jesus pronouncing condemnation on the temple. Not one stone will be left upon another. And then we see him exiting to the east and ending up on the Mount of Olives with his disciples. And we pointed out that that was a fulfillment, if you will, of Ezekiel's vision in chapters 10 and 11 of God leaving the temple by the east and leaving the temple godless, if you will, or bereft, or as unprotected and rejected. And of course, in Ezekiel, he himself was already in exile when he had this vision. And he had this vision of, and the temple was then in his lifetime destroyed. And so all these themes kind of come together here in chapter 13. And as we worked our way through it, we found two things that we would call pretty well-established principles as we try to understand the chapter. All of us, Pastor Dana, Pastor Dennis, and I, we freely admit this is a difficult chapter. We don't have everything nailed down. We're just trying to work our way through and get the gist and try to get the understanding as best as we can. But there's two things that we said seem to be very clear. Number one, that the discourse to the disciples was in answer to the disciples' question there in verse 4. When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming? And Jesus, along with answering the disciples' question, we see that the thrust of Jesus's words was in the form of a warning. It was preparatory. It was to get them ready for what they were going to face, to help them be alert, to stay watchful as they look at the events that unfold in their lives. So that's one thing that we felt was very well established in the chapter. In other words, maybe to put it in a negative way, Jesus was not giving this discourse to give them step A, B, C, and D of what's going to happen. That wasn't his thrust. His thrust was to prepare them with larger, if you will, or more widespread themes, or not specific events, but more linked type of occurrences that they would be able to then understand what the age, not only them, but us as we read through this now in our day. The second thing that we felt was fairly well established, and Pastor Dana spent a good bit of time last week looking through verses 5 through 13, that Jesus, in describing this age of that it's going to be an age of tribulation, it's going to be an age of family members fighting against one another, and the disciples or Christians being called before the authorities and having to give an answer, and brother delivering brother to death, and hated by all, verse 13, for my name's sake. And it's anyway, that this characterizes not just the age that the disciples lived in, but seems to characterize the entire age from Jesus's first coming to his second coming. And the reason that one of the reasons at least that we think that that's fairly well established is how well this description of the age, how well it meshes with the other descriptions that we find in the New Testament about what people are going to face and what we're going to go through. That this is a time of suffering. This is the time of joy and experiencing heavenly realities, but it is a time of living also in a cursed world that hates God and therefore hates us as God's representatives. And so these two things help us now, as we're going to be looking at verses 14 to 23, a much more difficult section of the message than what is earlier. But I think if we keep our touchstones on those two things that I just mentioned, I think it'll be a little bit easier for us to work our way through. So let me just read, I'll read it for everybody, verses 14 through 23. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it would not happen in winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on your guard. I have told you all things beforehand. And just before we get into the actual looking at the verses, I want to just again say that there's three main schools of thought of how to interpret this. And I'm talking about the entire chapter, the entire discourse. I don't know that we did this quite as overtly, so I thought it might be helpful for us all to be on the same page. There's three main schools. First school is that the entire discourse is something that is future, that none of it is fulfilled in AD 70, that none of it was fulfilled in the lifetime of the disciples. None of it's even been fulfilled in our lifetime, 2,000 years later, but that it's all something that will come and has relevance to Jesus' second coming. That's one school of thought. And of course, within these three main schools of thought, there's just literally dozens of sub-schools or areas that within those three big headings you find men and women advocating different nuanced positions within it. The first one is a futurist position. The second one is what we call the preterist position, if you will, a past position that everything in these chapters was fulfilled in the lifetime of the disciples, most particularly around AD 67 to 70, when Jerusalem was surrounded by the Roman army. They were starved out, and eventually Jerusalem was captured and the temple was utterly destroyed. And we find Jesus's words literally fulfilled, not one stone left upon another. So that would be the second main school. They would see everything here as finding its fulfillment and culmination in the Roman destruction of both the city and the temple. The third main school of thought, and this is the one that I think pastors, that three of us would fall into, is that this discourse has elements of both fulfillment in AD 70 and fulfillment in the future. that there's characteristics in here that concern the entire age of the church, as I said a little bit earlier, and we feel that that's fairly well supported in the rest of the New Testament, even can be supported by the book of Revelation, although that doesn't hold a whole lot of weight because, as you well know, the book of Revelation has three main ways of looking at it: past, future, and present. So, but our view is that Jesus is describing the entire church age leading up to his second coming. And so there's parts of it, for instance, what we're going to look at tonight, that seems to specifically deal with AD 70 and the destruction of the temple. There's other parts of it that I think we'll deal with the next lesson, starting verse 24 through 27, that seem to have elements dealing with the second coming, the apocalyptic language of the stars being dropped from heaven and all of the cosmic signs, Jesus gathering his elect from the four corners, things like that. The difficulty with holding this third position is how on earth do you know what applies to what? And there's no real, you do your best, and that's what we're going to present tonight. You just simply do your best to try to take all the factors into account, not only the factors in the address itself, in the chapter, in the larger context of the book of Mark, as he presents Jesus as the God coming in the flesh, leading his people on a second Exodus. And so we have to factor all of that in. And then, of course, out into the broader perspective of fitting it into the New Testament and the eschatology that is taught, for instance, in 2 Thessalonians 2 that we looked at a while ago, 1 Thessalonians 4, the book of Revelation. So we find even John, even in 1 John, as we've just gone through chapter 2, talking about the Antichrist. The Antichrist is coming, but yet many Antichrists are there. And so we have to try to work to fit all of those things together. And so all of that to say, I freely admit that I might be very wrong in the view that I'm going to give you tonight. I also freely admit that there are, even in the view that I take, there are some unsatisfying parts of it. There's just some things that make me uncomfortable, even though I'm holding the view. But that's just the way the chapter is. And one reason that I feel comfortable saying I'm uncomfortable with certain parts of it is no matter what view you take, there's going to be verses that are going to make you uncomfortable. And you're going to have to fit a verse, an explanation on a verse that may not be your normal way of explaining that particular verse. So we'll just start in verse 14 and go through verse 19 to begin with. And then we'll pick up and look at 20 to 23. And the reason I'm breaking it there between 19 and 20 is I'm going to make the case that verses 14 through 19 seem to be a close-up view of the larger tribulation that was talked about in verses 5 through 13. Remember, we said that talked about the church age between Jesus' first and second coming. Now, what appears and what I'm going to suggest to you is that 5 through 13 is, if you will, a bird's eye view or a panoramic view of what life is going to be like in the age between the testaments. And it's talking, of course, about persecution. It's an age of tribulation. Verses 14 through 19 then seem to go from that panoramic view down to a more focused view, dealing with particularly the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And then from verses 20 onward, well, through 23 at least, we seem to zoom back out into more of a panoramic view of history. And I will give some supporting reasons why I think that that's a reasonable way to approach this part of the text. So let's start with verse 14. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and etc., talking about the action that the disciples at that point in time should take. Jesus really throws us a curveball by using this phrase, abomination of desolation. And let me explain why. He draws that from Daniel, of course. It's used 4 different times in Daniel, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 11, and chapter 12. And in my view, at least, I realize this is somewhat up for debate, but in my view, every one of those instances, 8, 9, 11, and 12, is dealing with the same person and the same event. It's prophetic, looking forward to Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the Syrian. He was the leader of the Syrian part of Alexander's empire, of the Greek empire. Alexander the Great came, conquered the known world. He died young. His empire is eventually divided 4 ways. Antiochus rose to power in this Syrian element, and he then tried to take over the Egyptian element. And of course, familiar with your geography, Syria's up here, Egypt's down here. What's in the middle but Judea, Palestine? He had to go through that. He was rebuffed in Egypt. In fact, if you remember your history, that famous phrase, to draw a line in the sand, that's where it came from. Because Antiochus, when he went to Egypt, was met by a force of Roman military soldiers. And the commander of the Roman soldiers drew a line in the sand and said, if you cross this, you are declaring war on Rome, and we will answer that call. Well, Antiochus, of course, was furious, and he went back north through Judea. And he wreaked utter devastation upon the Jews. He was a total madman filled with utter hatred of Judaism. It was like he was Satan incarnate almost in his zeal to wipe out the Jewish religion. And somewhere in a time frame of 167 to 164 BC, he waged this war where he killed hundreds of thousands of Jews. He installed his own high priest. He killed the legitimate priests. He installed his own high priest. He banned the Torah. He banned the scriptures, so that anybody that was in possession of a Bible, if you will, at that time, the Old Testament, was given the death penalty. He utterly desecrated the temple. He erected an altar over top of the altar of burnt offering in the temple, put a statue of Zeus there, and sacrificed all kinds of unclean animals, pigs and whatnot, creating his own religion. His whole goal was to wipe out Judaism and install the Hellenistic culture, if you will, the Greek culture. My point into going into all of that is that when the Jews heard the term abomination of desolation, this is the period of time they called them on. This 3.5 years, 167 to 164, which, by the way, Daniel uttered this prophecy probably about 550 or so BC. So we're looking at 400 years, and then it was fulfilled, or seemed to be fulfilled. The Feast of Hanukkah that the Jews still celebrate was the celebration of the rededication of the temple after the Syrians were defeated, Judas Maccabeus and his gang and all of that history there. Very fascinating, by the way. But that seemed to settle Daniel's words about the abomination of desolation. That seemed to be the utter fulfillment of it, but obviously not, because here we have Jesus 100 or so years later coming to the temple, and he says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where you ought not to be. So obviously Antiochus wasn't a complete fulfillment, you see. But I believe he was a down payment. He was a pointer looking forward to what Jesus is here referring to. And he's, so to me, that's a very strong answer or reason why this particular section has to do with AD 70 and the looting and destroying of the temple by the Romans. A second reason that I would believe that this abomination of desolation passage is talking about AD 67 to 70 is that Daniel specifically prophesied that this abominable person or thing, we're still not sure whether it's a thing or a person, because both pronouns are used. But he specifically prophesied that it would be set up in the temple, that it would take place at the temple. We saw that fulfilled with Antiochus. And we see that the fulfillment in AD 67 to 70 centered on the temple as well. Now here's a very interesting point that I wasn't aware of. How much time do I have? Still got some time, so I'll bore you with a little more of my research. But many commentators, and I think there's something here, many commentators believe the abomination was not Titus and the Roman army that came in and physically destroyed the temple. But they believe the abomination was the Jewish zealots that took over the temple before the Romans ever got in the city. You see, there was a revolt within Judaism about this time. You remember the zealots. In fact, Simon the Zealot was one of the disciples of Jesus. But as time went on, the zealots gained more power, and they advocated, of course, a total overthrow of Rome and a total independence of Judaism. And so they managed to get into the temple and made it kind of their own fortress. They took it over, and it was like a city within a city. And they killed a whole bunch of people, and they desecrated the priests, and they set up again their own priests. And so many commentators believe that the abomination Jesus is talking about here rose up from within Israel, that it was Israel's disobedience, it was Israel's rejection of God that was what was referred to, and that Israel was simply getting the just deserts from God through, of course, Titus and his army that their disobedience called for. Anyway, I don't take a position on that necessarily at this point, but I thought it was very interesting that rather than it being Gentile armies being referred to, that instead it was Jews that were unbelieving Jews that were acting like Gentiles that ended up bringing the judgment on the temple. But anyway, the fact that Jesus uses this language from Daniel that refers, number one, to a historical event of desecrating the temple. Secondly, that Daniel specifically said that this abomination will be centered around the temple. And then thirdly, that from verses 14 through 18, Jesus' instructions to his disciples really have relevance almost solely to first century life in Palestine. You notice there the number of things Jesus says to them. If you're in Jerusalem, flee, go to the mountains. If you're on a housetop, and of course, we don't live on housetops. We don't use our housetops, but they did there very much in the first century, didn't they? And even before that, but in the first century, don't enter the house. Jesus talking about the urgency to get out of Jerusalem. Let not the one in the field turn back to take his cloak. Alas, for women who are pregnant and nursing infants in those days, pray that it may not happen in winter. In Matthew's account, there's a phrase that says, pray that would not happen in winter or on the Sabbath. And so in Matthew's account, Jesus obviously would, by mentioning the Sabbath, believe that this abomination will be set up and the disciples are to flee during a time when the Sabbath laws were still in effect. And so all of these things together tend to make me believe that we're looking at a close-up of this period of time from 67 to 70 that is really a small segment of the larger part of verses 5 through 13, dealing with the whole period of time of tribulation in between Jesus' coming. And also remember, if you will, that Jesus was answering his disciples' question about when will these stones be thrown down. And so it makes sense that he would include some section of his response to them that deals with that actual question, when will these things be? Now, having laid all that out to you, look at verse 19, because it almost destroys everything that I just laid out here. Let me read verse 19. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now, and never will be. So if we accept what I've just presented to you, that this section of scripture deals with the fall of Jerusalem, the surrounded by armies and the starving, the famines. If we accept that, then we have to be able to explain what verse 19 means, which seems pretty straightforward what Jesus is saying here, that this siege and eventual destruction of Jerusalem is the worst thing that's ever happened in history, not just up to that time, but he adds the phrase and ever will be, that there wouldn't be anything like this again. The best answer and the best thing that I can come up with, I found this quote from D.A. Carson, and I will give you his words in answer to the question I just raised. There have been greater numbers of deaths 6 million in the Nazi death camps, mostly Jews, and an estimated 20 million under Stalin. There have been greater number of deaths, but never so high a percentage of a great city's population that was so thoroughly and painfully exterminated and enslaved as during the fall of Jerusalem. So what he's saying is, as far as God bringing judgment on a people for their rejection of him, that this calamity that befell Jerusalem really does qualify as being the worst tribulation that has taken place. Again, I said earlier, there are some explanations of some verses that are going to be unsatisfying. This is one of the things I was talking about. I'm not 100% persuaded that view is correct, but I can almost get there. Particularly if we confine it to people that were God's people. As again, Jesus is dealing with his disciples' question, the signs, the end of the age, and when they can see the temple destroyed. One of the things, and again, I know I'm running out of time here, but again, one of the things also that has helped me think through this has been the tremendous prophetic importance that the temple occupied, and how the first temple, when it was destroyed, how absolutely and utterly that affected the Jews, and how theologically they believed that they were utterly bereft of God. They believed that they had gone beyond any amount of help, that they were irredeemable at that point. That you read Lamentations, for instance, and some of the other prophets, and how much the temple signified their religion. And so I believe that that element is a part of Jesus's discourse here, in one way or another. But anyway, let's move on, and then we'll take some questions if you have some questions after I get through. But the next section would be verse 20 through 23. And as I mentioned earlier, I believe that these verses pan back out into a broad view of all of history again. And there's a couple of textual clues I'm going to bring out here to support that position. But if you, let me just read them again. If the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on your guard, I've told you all things beforehand. Again, there's just a couple of things in here that lead me to believe that the focus has now pulled back into a larger panoramic view of all of time. And the first thing that leads me to believe that is the two phrases in Greek that are translated. The first one, no human being, verse 20. It's literally no flesh. And the second phrase in verse 20, the elect, no human being, but for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. When we see those phrases in Scripture, it almost always refers to the large group of humanity or the large group of God's people. They're not narrowly focused. And if we would continue thinking that verse 20 deals with the fall of Jerusalem and that those days were cut short, so the elect alive at that point, it seems just too narrow to focus it on one little short section of time from 67 to 70. Secondly, the warning against looking for Christ or thinking that going after the claims of false Christ and false prophets. That seems to be a characteristic that goes for us all across the ages of Christianity. That's not just something that would apply to that section of time from 67 to 70 AD. We saw that, as I said, in 1 John 2, as we looked at that passage of the Antichrist. Many Antichrists have gone out into the world. So it seems that when Jesus is calling attention to not falling to false Christ, that he would be talking about a more extensive period of time, a wider period of time. And then a final factor is the fact that Mark kind of delineates this section in verse 23 by repeating the warning to be watchful, to be on your guard. And we find that in verses 5 and verse 9. And it just seems like he's included this here to make us think backwards to the broader period of time, the broader scope that he originally started his address with his disciples. So again, that's kind of briefly how I would view this passage, and I think it has some merit in terms of helping us to get through. I fully expect that you will disagree with me on certain areas, and that's okay. I think disagreement is healthy, and as long as we can interact with one another and come to each of us come to a position that is that we are comfortable with, I think that's what we need to do. I think that's important. So let me just throw it open for the next few minutes if anybody has